Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight,
seeing the rates climbing after 4th of July really knocked the wind out of our sails.
the tough choices some parents have had to make as Chicago Public Schools returns to in-person learning full-time today.
The Taliban, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda are tracking down individuals every day and killing them.
Chicago immigration groups scramble to resettle Afghan refugees as the U.S. officially announces an end to the 20-year war.
Hurricane Ida makes landfall and pummels Louisiana exactly 16 years after Hurricane Katrina left more than 1,800 people dead.
Community reaction to the controversial Amazon lockers being installed all around the city.
As part of our First-Hand Living in Poverty series, we hear about the current state of food insecurity in Chicago and possible solutions.
After a strong summer, Labor Day weekend is seeing low airline bookings. That and more business news from Cranes.
This place is to African American history.
From the Civil War to civil rights and everything in between, even in death, the lives of these prominent black Chicagoans are educating others.
You know what? You got spunk.
And beloved actor Ed Asner died yesterday. We'll talk about his career and his impact on Chicago theater with an author who knew him well. But first, some of today's top stories. The indoor mask mandate is now back. Everyone over the age of 2 are now required to wear a mask in all indoor settings. Governor J.B. Pritzker hopes the move will slow the spread of the highly transmissible COVID-19 Delta variant as hospitals around the state are running out of beds. The mandate applies statewide to both the vaccinated and unvaccinated. And the CDC is now recommending masking outdoors for people who can't maintain a 6-foot distance. A police officer has been taken off the street and placed on administrative duty this evening. This after the Civilian Office of Police Accountability investigated a physical altercation between a black woman and a white police officer. That happened around midnight on Saturday when the woman was walking her dog and was told to leave North Avenue Beach in Lincoln Park. The video shared widely on social media shows Nikita Brown walking away from the officer. The two exchange words, and when she looks down at her phone, the officer grabs her arm. It's unclear if he's trying to restrain her or if the scuffle is over her phone. Brown can be heard screaming as the officer twists her around. Brown's attorneys are calling the incident a, quote, obvious case of racial profiling. Mayor Lori Lightfoot says she was, quote, deeply concerned.
I was quite disturbed by what I saw. It looked like the woman was following the direction of the officer and leaving the beach. That matter is under investigation.
And that COPA investigation is ongoing, we should mention. There's more on this story on our website. And it was the first day of school today for Chicago Public School students, but some parents were left scrambling after more than 2,000 kids did not have bus service. About 90 bus drivers quit or retired last week after the city imposed vaccine mandates. That means the district is now short about 500 drivers. Mayor Lightfoot blames the bus company for the transportation shortage.
Our primary focus is on making sure that our kids get to school safely and that they are around adults who are fully vaccinated, which is why CPS put in a mandatory vaccine mandate for all CPS employees that have to be fully vaccinated by October 15th.
And those 2,100 families got $1,000 to get their students back to school. Moving forward, CPS will give a $500 per month stipend for transportation to the students who are stranded now without service. And up next, more on how the first day of school went for CPS students and staff right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
It's been a long time coming, and now Chicago public school students are back in the classrooms full time. It was almost a year and a half ago that students attended in-person learning 5 days a week, and it looked much different then than it does today. Brandis has been covering the first day of school, and Brandis, a lot different this year than last year, obviously.
Yeah, that's right, Paris. A lot. You know, this time last year, students were starting remote learning across the district. But today, principals, teachers, and staff welcome students back into the classroom for full-time in-person learning. And considering the number of changes that have been implemented since the last time all students were in classrooms full-time, it's obviously a day of nerves as well. District schools reopened to social distancing, mask wearing, air filters in every classroom, and of course, lots of hand sanitizer. Mayor Lightfoot visited some schools today, welcoming students and teachers, and says she's confident in the plan that schools have for keeping students safe.
We have a specific protocol that we really put in place last spring when we opened up the elementary schools and then carried that through the high schools. It continues this year. And I won't get into the specific details, but we start with the classroom, then if necessary the school, and then obviously the system. But these are all things that we worked out in the various agreements with the Chicago Teachers Union that were subsequently ratified by the House of Delegates. We'll continue to monitor, obviously, on a daily basis where we are in the pandemic.
And Brandis, we've been following this, over the last couple of weeks. The Teachers Union and CPS are at odds. Are they still negotiating these safety measures?
Yes, they are actually, even though schools have resumed. They are still working on a new Memorandum of Understanding, or an MOU. And contrary to what we just heard from the mayor, CTU argues that the city is rolling back some of those layered safety mitigations that they agreed to last winter and spring when schools reopened in phases. So, for example, CTU says the previous MOU called for a minimum 6 feet of social distancing, but the new guidance only calls for 3 feet. Temperature checks were previously mandatory for anyone entering the building, now only for 6 students. And parents are asked to keep their kids home, of course, if they have symptoms. And while the district did surveillance testing for employees and students, the district is now offering tests if students or staff report symptoms and only requiring it for unvaccinated students in sports.
You know, we hear the mayor talk about how safe school was in the winter and the spring of last school year when they returned, but we're also dealing with her negotiating team that doesn't acknowledge it because their proposals run counter to which she claims is a success story. So it's frustrating, a little cognitive dissonance there as well, but we're still there.
Now, while thousands of parents sent their kids back into the classroom today, with or without trepidation, there are some families who opted out of the district entirely. We spoke with one such family, a house of 3 CPS students, or former CPS students, because they elected to remove all 3 in favor of homeschooling. And the youngest of the 3 is not vaccinated, and he's immunocompromised. Mom, Cassandra Kachaha, said they couldn't just take the risk.
Principals, teachers are doing what they can, but we don't feel like it's safe. As Dr. Arwady said, there's going to be transmission in schools. And for high-risk families, that's an unacceptable proposition. So we are back in our bubble and doing what we can to make sure that our family does not catch COVID.
And Brandis, I know the school district lost about 14,000 students out of something like 350,000.
Yeah, 350,000 down to 340-something thousand last year.
What's the status this year?
So it depends on how you look at it. You know, of course, last year during the pandemic, losing 14,000 students in the middle of a pandemic, that's a lot even then. Typically, the district loses 6,000 to 7,000 students per year, somewhere in there. Now, there are concerns, though, that this year could be worse. The district reports some 100,000 students are in a risk category, at risk of dropping out. Interim CEO Jose Torres explains how the district arrived at that figure based on attendance, grades, discipline, and truancy.
The way that we broke 100,000 was really around 80% that were at lower risk, but they were still in that count, and about 18,000 that were in the highest risk. And so it really depends on which ones where those 25,000 students might be, and I don't think it would have reached up to 25,000, but it would be we're continuing to do the work.
And we should be clear, that number doesn't necessarily mean 100,000 students will drop out. But one local organization is sounding the alarm bell on the problem, noting that the district could lose a lot of money if enrollment falls substantially. There are long-term economic impacts as well. The head of Kids First Chicago, which works to empower parents, argues the best way to find out why young people are disengaged is to ask the students themselves.
I think our prioritization on students this past year has really been looking at, like, what are they missing? What are they losing from an academic standpoint, which is really important. But I worry that by prioritizing that first, we're missing something really apparent, which is how do we make school an engaging space for students, which I do think that if you don't ask them directly why they're disengaged, we're not going to get the right answer.
Now, the school district says over the summer it began work to re-engage those nearly 100% of those students and has had contact, in fact, with 75% of them. Paris, school year ahead.
100,000 students, though, that's a lot. That's
a
huge
lot
chunk
of students, and no one's saying that's definitely going to happen, but even a fraction of that is a lot.
Yeah, at risk. All right, a lot for CPS to handle, a lot for parents to handle right now. All right, thank you very much. And United States defense officials make it official today. The 20-year war in Afghanistan is over. Today, the last military evacuation flights left Kabul. And to date, the White House says more than 116,000 people have been evacuated since the drawdown of American troops, but not everyone has been able to escape. Hundreds of Afghan refugees could settle in the Chicago area in the coming weeks, and local immigrant groups are working around the clock to try and make that happen. Kash Fazal is a Chicago-based Afghan-American immigration lawyer. She says she's working to get 150 refugees out of Afghanistan because she fears they may not have long to live.
If they continue to remain in Afghanistan, some of my clients' information has been compromised. So the Taliban, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda are tracking down individuals every day and killing them.
Fazal says she's secured or in the process of securing special visa status for most of her clients. But last week's deadly suicide bombing that killed 13 American service members and hundreds more civilians has made passage to the Kabul airport nearly impossible. One of her clients sent this video of chaos outside the airport late last week.
They're not allowing anyone even near the parameters outside of the airport, so a lot of families have been sent home.
Today, a coalition of immigrant and refugee organizations, along with Illinois public officials, said they would do everything they could to successfully resettle Afghans who worked with U.S. forces. They say they anticipate 500 relocating to Chicago.
Chicago is a welcoming city. Mayor Lightfoot believes unequivocally and profoundly in everything that term means.
But the groups are calling on President Biden and Congress to expedite the special immigrant visa process, not only for Afghan allies, but their families that remain in danger.
Fulfilling our promise to those who risk their lives to save American lives is not simply something we should do, it's something we must do.
Fazal says it's already too late for one of her clients. He was killed last week by the Taliban after receiving a U.S. visa from the embassy in Kabul. She says the Taliban attempted to extort him.
He went back home, obtained the money, came back, and they followed him, and then they targeted him and killed him.
Seema Qureshi runs the Muslim Women's Resource Center in Chicago. She says she is not only worried for refugee clients of hers, but an Afghan-American employee of hers who is trapped on the ground in Kabul.
His Afghan-American wife and his 6-month son are counting minutes for his safe arrival. But he has no clear path to safety.
And the refugee groups say time is running short as the U.S. and other coalition countries wind down their evacuation efforts. Meanwhile, 17 members of Chicago City Council signed a letter today addressed to President Joe Biden saying the city stands ready to help federal agencies resettle Afghans right here in Chicago. And the other big news of the day, a massive search and rescue, cleanup, and recovery effort underway after Hurricane Ida barreled into Louisiana and Mississippi. Ida made landfall as a Category 4 hurricane and has done, quote, catastrophic damage to electrical infrastructure, leaving more than 1 million people, including residents of the entire city of New Orleans, without power. Ida struck exactly 16 years to the day that Hurricane Katrina pummeled the city, leaving more than 1,800 dead. This time, New Orleans appears to have spared the worst, but other areas have not been so lucky. And joining us now to help us understand the ferocity of the storm and the recovery effort are Scott Collis, an atmospheric scientist from Argonne National Laboratory, Karen Smilowitz, professor of engineering at Northwestern University and a specialist in humanitarian logistics, and Selena Roldan, CEO of the American Red Cross in Illinois. Welcome all of you back to Chicago tonight.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And Scott, I'll start with you. So put this in context. How powerful has this storm been?
Hurricane Ida made landfall as a Category 4 hurricane, which is that second highest strength that we have numbers for, but of course a single number doesn't tell the whole story. This hurricane was packing 150 mile per hour plus winds. That is until it broke many of the wind sensors that are actually used to record how strong it is.
So it could have even been higher than that. Selena Roldan, what's the situation right now in terms of people that have lost power, that are out of their homes and seeking shelter?
Yes, so over 1 million people across Louisiana, Mississippi are currently without power, and we're talking about 90-degree temperatures, which is just incredibly devastating. So the American Red Cross is on the ground now with our partners, helping people that were impacted by this devastating disaster, providing shelter, meals, comfort to people in need. Sunday night, over 2,500 people sought shelter in over 60 Red Cross and community shelters. American Red Cross has over 350 workers on the ground, with over hundreds more heading to that area from across the country. And from the Illinois region alone, we have sent over 15 volunteers to help respond to Hurricane Ida.
And Karen Smilowitz, as I understand, the mayor of New Orleans didn't call for a mandatory evacuation of the whole city, just parts of the city close to the levee. Has the government approached evacuation and relief here? I know we're only in a few hours of relief, but has it approached it the right way, you think?
Well, I think given the time frame, when you heard the mayor talk about why it wasn't mandatory, it really was stressing what would happen to the roadways. And so there were evacuations in coastal communities, mandatory evacuations where it needed to be done. But then you have to think about the numbers of people. And with the short time frame that they had, it wouldn't be possible. What would happen is you'd see just massive numbers of people trying to leave on highways when the storm was hitting. So doing the best of
Certainly, we've seen those images in natural disasters in the past. Scott Collis, a lot has been talked about with this storm, that it gained power over the Gulf, that the Gulf waters are a little bit warmer than normal. Can you explain what happened there?
Yeah, Ida underwent what we call rapid intensification. And while this is a horrible, terrible event, it's fascinating from a meteorological point of view, because you go from a storm that seemed fairly benign, it was a Category 2 just, a day before hitting, and then ramping up to a Category 4, just about skipping Category 3. And the reason was, as you pointed out, Paris, there was this really warm pool of water right up against the coast. And August is already one of the warmest times of year for the Gulf of Mexico. And those warm waters are like rocket fuel for hurricanes. We often talk about all these storms having ingredients that make them severe. Well, for hurricanes, warm water is like ingredient 1, 2, and 3. The waters just along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico there were running about 2 degrees Celsius warmer than normal.
And Scott Collis, I'll stick with you here. This is always a dicey discussion when it comes to these natural events and how much climate change plays a role here. But do you think climate change is playing a role in causing the warmer waters, which, as you just explained for us, soups up these storms?
This is about as undicey as it gets, Paris. As I said, hurricanes, survive on warm water. The ocean is where most of the energy from climate change is going right now. And hurricanes are huge weather systems, so a lot less randomness, a lot less chaos in there. So this is about as close as it gets as being able to directly attribute a single storm to climate change. This one was supercharged by the excess energy that's trapped by greenhouse gases.
Certainly hard to deny the impacts of climate change in our day-to-day weather events. Now, Selena, what are the most concrete ways viewers watching now can assist folks in New Orleans and in Mississippi?
No, absolutely. Thank you, Paris. And this is a devastating event, as we're talking about, and really want to emphasize again that many of the communities impacted were still just recovering from Hurricane Laura and Hurricane Delta last year, and now they're facing another very lengthy recovery. So for the American Red Cross, we are just getting started. We're just getting started, just starting to understand the full long-term impact. So we are going to be there in the weeks and the months to come. So the best ways that someone can support the American Red Cross is by giving your time. We are looking for volunteers both locally and nationally, and also to make a financial donation by going to 1-800-RED-CROSS or to redcross.org. It's important for people to know that 90 cents of every dollar that the American Red Cross brings in goes to providing comfort and care to those affected directly by Hurricane Ida.
All right, Karen Smilowitz, I mean, given the climate change discussion here, it appears that we're going to have more of these events in the Gulf region. We remember Hurricane Katrina this day so many years ago, and the aftermath was devastating. Have the relief agencies and government improved the infrastructure to assist people in the aftermath of a storm like this since then?
I mean, you heard that in Selena's answer just now about being very targeted in ways to help. Right, the coordination has to be among people who want to help, and Selena gave a really good discussion of how you can do that. And then also at the government level, you know, while there may not have been enough time to do a mandatory evacuation, what you did see was the government step up their planning ahead of time, right? And so you saw FEMA activated, you saw pre-positioning of resources, of crews, search and rescue, so bringing to the area who is needed. Now you see that with coordination of restoration of power. There are difficult choices about prioritizing restoration of power. And so I do think that on the coordination and communication, not just within the government, but all of the organizations like the Red Cross that assist. So
we've come a long way since Katrina. Scott Collis, seeing as how, you know, climate change is happening and waters are warmer, how in danger is the city of New Orleans and the area around there? You know, we talk about how low-lying it is, and we talk about disappearing swampland, disappearing bayou. What's the future hold for that city?
Well, I want to point out two positives in this terrible news story. For one thing, the levees held, which is fantastic. The engineering that went into it was great. This was a more powerful storm, not as large, but wind-wise, a more powerful storm than Katrina. Number two, NOAA, the National Weather Service, absolutely nailed this forecast. They had an accurate track on Thursday. So that allowed, you know, folks like Selena, organization to really plan for this. So, but we're living climate change right now. This is no longer looking into the future. And the work that is going into a place like New Orleans is the work that needs to be done around the nature in improving our resiliency to these high-end impacts.
All right, well, we'll continue to follow the relief efforts. And our thanks to Scott Collis, Karen Smilowitz, and Selena Roldan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
And up next, Amanda Vinicky and controversial lockers in local parks. So please stay with us.
It really is about community where we all come together.
Chicago needs to make space for everyone.
Take a walk in a Chicago park or go for a jog, play Frisbee, maybe softball, and pick up your latest goods from Amazon. The e-commerce giant recently began installing lockers in Chicago public parks and says the lockers are a benefit to the community. In a statement, an Amazon spokesperson says the focus of our partnership has been to provide park patrons and community members with access to a secure and convenient delivery option. But that so-called convenience has proven controversial. Joining us to talk about these delivery lockers in Chicago is Juanita Irizarry, the executive director at Friends of the Parks. Thanks so much. We did, by the way, invite a representative from the Chicago Park District to join this conversation, but they declined. We also reached out to a couple of city council members who support the lockers in Chicago parks. They were unable, also declined our invitation. So Juanita, to you, you are no fan of them. Why not?
Well, you know, it may be convenient to go pick up your item at a Chicago park, but that is not the purpose of public parks. Chicago really needs a place to go to enjoy nature, for the sake of our mental health and our physical health in the midst of so much crisis, the last thing we need is an e-commerce giant staring us in the face.
Also, some safety concerns?
Certainly. We look at it in two different ways. Number one, you might get robbed while you're picking up your item in the middle of the park, but you're also inviting people to step onto the park premises to pick up their package, possibly after 11 p.m. when the parks are closed. And based on what we saw this weekend of a police officer accosting a woman walking her dog on the lakefront, it's dangerous to be in a park after hours because actually you might get attacked by a police person as well.
Post-curfew there, we have a story about that on our website. Now, I know a lot of members of the community likewise have backlash, but not everyone is against these. The Park District, in fact, issuing a statement that highlighted supporters of these locker hubs, including one from 11th Ward Alderman Patrick Daley Thompson, who said, "I commend the Park District for trying to creatively generate new revenue for our parks. Not only do the Amazon lockers provide a benefit for our neighbors who utilize the lockers, it also generates revenue that goes directly into funding park programs for our children." So, Juanita, the Park District says it needs or wants more money. Why not get it from a highly profitable corporation versus going to taxpayers?
Well, it's a very slippery slope when you're looking to generate revenue from activities that are off mission. The Chicago Park District should really focus on revenue generating activities that keeps it focused on programming for kids, on recreation, on investing in our green space. One might say we should have video gambling in a park if you just want to use the argument that anything that generates revenue for the park is good for the park.
Is there any price that would be worth it to you? I believe, according to the contract that was obtained by Block Club, the Park District is charging Amazon between $50 and $125, and so could net by the end of the year between $100,000 and $200,000. Is there a higher price that would make this acceptable, or perhaps a different sort of activity along these lines that you would deem appropriate?
Yeah, Friends of the Parks really thinks that even if there was a lot more revenue generated by this contract, it's still the wrong place to go looking for money for our parks. It really is incumbent upon the Park District to get that money from appropriate sources, and actually our tax base is an appropriate source to pay for public amenities.
Now, the initial plan is to have at least 100 of these locker hub locations. The Park District tells us that 46 have been installed thus far, but after a whole lot of pushback, 4 were removed from parks. Amazon likewise telling WTTW in a statement that it took immediate action to respond to concerns when they were there, and that it is reviewing the other locker installations in Chicago. So in your eyes, is this, for now, while a contract is in place, an appropriate happy medium, or what are the next steps?
Well, we look forward to their thorough review, but ultimately hope and expect that they will walk this contract back. We heard Alderwoman Hairston late last week say that she has asked the Park District to take all of the boxes out of her ward. And we think as further review takes place and a more thoughtful process, that the Park District will need to decide that this was a mistake, and they'll have to look for other ways to generate revenue.
Now, Amazon says that it has been working with the Chicago Park District since last year, and that these lockers were brought at the Park District's expense. Is that a surprise to you as somebody who closely follows what's going on in our parks?
Well, the Park District did this in a way that was not vetted publicly. They say that the contract was so small that they did not have to bring it to a Board of Commissioners review process, which helped us understand why we as staff at Friends of the Parks, who go to all of the Board of Commissioners meetings, had not heard anything about this. We do know that they had little bits of conversation with some park advisory councils, and there were a couple that thought it was okay. We also know of another park advisory council that sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the Park District when these lockers were foisted upon them because they didn't think that they were a good idea.
And in the brief time that we have left, Juanita, let's say that the Park District had been more transparent or vocal about this, and that the public sentiment was, yes, we want these hubs in our parks. Would you be all right with it then, perhaps bringing people to parks that wouldn't otherwise go and visit?
we think people should visit parks, but we don't think it's an Amazon box that will get them there. And we do believe in democracy, and we think everyone should lift up their voice, and people are not going to agree. But there hasn't been another issue that has led to such a bombardment of our phone lines and our emails with people really upset about this and connecting with Friends of the Parks for the first time to push back against it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your viewpoints with everyone here at Chicago Tonight. That was Juanita Irizarry with Friends of the Parks. And now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
Amanda, thank you. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, McDonald's mulls over closing indoor dining to customers as the Delta variant surges. That and more from Cranes. In the next installment of our Firsthand Living in Poverty series, we hear about how the pandemic has exacerbated food insecurity in Chicago. Remembering beloved actor Ed Asner, who died yesterday, a local author on Asner's wide-ranging career and his impact on Chicago theater. And we take you on a walking tour through a cemetery to hear the stories of some prominent Black Chicagoans. But first, some more of today's top stories. The state's indoor mask mandate starts today. Everyone 2 years old and up are now required to wear a mask inside, whether or not you're vaccinated. Governor J.B. Pritzker announced the move as hospitals around the state are struggling to find beds for sick patients. And the CDC is now recommending masking outdoors for people who can't maintain a 6-foot distance. And some good news for students who are struggling with their mental health. Illinois students will be able to take up to 5 mental health days per year without a doctor's note. It's a big shift after many parents saw their children struggling during the pandemic. That means calling in sick for mental and behavioral health issues are valid reasons to miss school, and students will be given the opportunity to make up schoolwork. The new law was signed by Governor J.B. Pritzker last week and takes effect on January 1st. And St. Sabina is bringing back its gun buyback program. This after the church gave out $25,000 for 210 guns last month. St. Sabina is asking people 25 and younger to turn in working guns for cash. A rifle is worth $100 and $200 for handguns or assault rifles. 2 donors are funding the church's gun buyback program. And now to Paris for some of today's top business headlines. Paris.
Thanks, Brandis. Airline bookings for Labor Day weekend are down despite being the last summer weekend to squeeze in a trip. McDonald's looks at closing indoor dining as the COVID Delta variant surges. And a local medical equipment maker is nearing a $10 billion deal. Here to go behind the headlines is Crane Chicago business editor Ann Dwyer. Ann, great to see you as always. So we know that airlines struggled mightily during the pandemic. It looked like things were getting back to normal this summer, but this Labor Day weekend not going to be normal for air travel. Explain.
That's right. The Delta variant is really the culprit here, Paris. You're correct that bookings are off nationwide, down 15% for the Labor Day weekend. And that's typically one of the busiest weekends in any airline's travel calendar. Now, the weakness is extending beyond Labor Day, actually. That's why some airlines like Southwest and American are now warning Wall Street to dial down their expectations for third quarter profits as travelers cut back on or simply cancel their plans.
So the Delta variant having a big impact on the air travel industry. Also the food service industry, one of the largest franchisers in the world, Chicago's McDonald's, considering closing off indoor dining because of the Delta variant. Is that true?
In certain areas, yes. Reuters reported today that there's internal communication at McDonald's guiding franchisees on how to shut down their stores if they feel they need to, at least the indoor dining component. The company has identified a yardstick that's basically in counties where there are 250 COVID cases per 100,000 people on a 3-week rolling average. They're recommending to their franchisees that they shut down indoor dining. Now, the Chicago area doesn't meet that standard right now, but there are certainly areas of the country that do and probably will, and it's likely that the drive-thrus are going to get pretty busy in those areas.
Certainly seeming areas in the south and southeast. Lastly, Ann, Baxter International is in advanced talks of buying out a Chicago-based medical equipment maker called Hillrom. What is significant about this deal?
Well, Paris, it's a big deal because it's a big deal. We're talking about a $10 billion offer here, and this is an acquisition that would be a very big ticket move for Baxter. It's one that would add a range of products to their existing lineup, including patient monitors and operating tables, that sort of thing. It's a combination that Baxter has wanted to make, actually, Paris, for some time now, but Hillrom has rebuffed Baxter's previous offers. Baxter wants to survive as an independent operator in a very rapidly consolidating industry, and they also want to shore up their stock price. Baxter's stock has sunk about 8% so far this year, while Hillrom's is up 36%.
Big dollar amount there. Lots of money we're talking about. All right, Ann, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Actor Ed Asner died yesterday at the age of 91. He was already an established character actor, having cut his teeth early here in Chicago when he was cast as Lou Grant in The Mary Tyler Moore Show, which led to this memorable scene in the very first episode.
You know what? You got spunk.
Well, yes.
I hate spunk.
Who could forget that line? And joining us now with more is Mark Larson, an author and educator who is working on an oral history of Ed Asner's life and career. Mark Larson, welcome to Chicago Tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us how you got to know Ed Asner.
I was working on a previous book called Ensemble, an Oral History of Chicago Theater. And Ed was a part of Chicago theater, especially in the very early days. And so I contacted him and thought, I might as well give it a try. And within 2 days or so, he responded and said, yeah, let's do an interview. So I flew out to New York, out to Los Angeles, and sat down at his desk with him and thoroughly enjoyed a couple days talking to him.
And you mentioned his connection to Chicago theater. He went to the University of Chicago. He dropped out after about a year, and he's sort of part of the DNA that eventually formed Second City. So tell us about that.
Yeah, the trajectory is interesting. Ed came to the University of Chicago, and he wasn't intending to study acting at all. In fact, there's no acting school there. And he met up with Paul Sills and David Shepard, and they drew him into a theater company called Playwrights Theater Club. And he did a couple of shows with them and really liked it, but then went off to the war. And when he came back, they cast him again. And by that time, the Playwrights Theater Club was kind of really starting to take off. And they had this extraordinary company of players. It included Mike Nichols and Elaine May and Barbara Harris and Fritz Weaver and Joyce Piven and Byrne Piven. And so all of this was happening suddenly in about 1953. And it was a very, very exciting time, and Ed was very much a part of that.
And as I understand, that was a precursor to the Compass Players, which then sort of led to Second City, if I have my history correct?
You've got it correct. The Playwrights Theater, although it produced a lot during its less than 2 years, it did only last about 2 years. When that disbanded, some of the original members of Playwrights then formed Compass Players. By then, though, Ed had gone off to New York, so he was not part of Compass Players.
And then he eventually settled in L.A., and of course his most famous role, Lou Grant, on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and then the spin-off Lou Grant. Obviously, this is a character we can relate to here in the news business. How enduring is that character?
How enduring? That's one of my great fascinations with this guy and this character is, that show was on in the 70s, and I remember watching it, when it was live, and I mean, it wasn't live, but it wasn't something that you could record and watch later, right? And I can distinctly remember the sound of his voice and all those characters. So when I came back to this book so many years later, I approached watching those shows with real trepidation. I was so afraid I wasn't going to like it. And I started watching them with my wife, and they absolutely hold up. They absolutely hold up really, really well. And I find that really fascinating.
Absolutely, still hold up today. You spoke with him for your biography pretty recently. What was that conversation like?
Well, I've talked to him a lot in the past. Actually, I started working on the book early in the pandemic, and so a lot of our conversations were via Zoom. But the last time I talked to him was in May 19th. And I spent a couple afternoons sitting with him, partly in his study and sitting at the kitchen table. And I remember, this is making me emotional. You just suddenly, I apologize. When the second day I was there, I walked in and he announced to me that Gavin MacLeod had just gone into hospice. And he said, that leaves John Amos, Betty White, and me. And that knowledge about Gavin, I think, created a very different feel for the conversation. That in the past year and a half, we'd have many, many conversations, but there's something very different in the feel of that conversation. And then something happened too. At the end of it, I shut off. He had to get physical therapy. Somebody was coming in, and so I shut off all my equipment, and we just chatted. And I realized it was a luxury I really had not often had with him. And he was extremely reflective, extremely warm. It wasn't performative like you are in an interview. I have a lot of strong memories and feelings about that last conversation.
I'm sure he enjoyed just reliving some of these memories with you, and clearly he meant a lot to you. I want to talk about one of the projects he did in recent years, the animated picture Up. Let's take a look at a clip from that.
We're on our way, Ellie.
And as I understand, you spoke with the director of this movie for your book. Were they confident in giving this role to Asner?
They actually considered James Garner, too. And I told Ed that because the directors told me. And when I told Ed, he said they considered him and they chose me. They weren't sure. Not right at first, but then they went to see him in a live performance of something. I can't remember what it was, but they went to see him in a live performance and they both went, this is it. This is perfect. And he was.
So he was a live theater actor in addition to movie and television, 7 Emmy Awards. He never really stopped working, and he was a ubiquitous presence on social media, by the way, in recent years. He was a bit of an activist. What's the enduring secret to his success here and his likability?
That's what I'm trying to unravel. I have some thoughts about it. One is this man, when you sit down with him, is absolutely authentic. He's very performative. He likes to joke around and he likes to tease you and that kind of thing. But at the same time, there's an authenticity to him that's extremely engaging. And I think that comes across on the screen. Also, he's just a fine actor. If you look at him in Rich Man, Poor Man, if you look at him in Roots, he's doing extraordinary work there. He was in a film with Lindsay Krause called Daniel, a Sidney Lumet film. And Lindsay told me something, that could serve as a response to your question. She said the way he attended to me, the way he focused on me was extraordinary. And I think that comes across on the screen too. Also, just the easy answer is he's an extremely likable human being.
It comes across, and an incredible actor who honed his chops partly here in Chicago. Mark, we look forward to that biography, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
In Paris, food insecurity continues to be a problem for some Chicagoans, made worse by the pandemic. According to Chicago Food Equity Agenda, in late 2020, 19% of people in the Chicago metro region faced food insecurity. Latino communities saw 29% insecurity, and Black communities saw 37%. The city recently announced its first ever food equity policy lead, who will be working alongside community partners to create an equitable food system in Chicago. Tonight, as part of our firsthand Living in Poverty series, we hear from some of those community partners about the current state of food insecurity in the city and possible solutions. So joining us now are Angela Odoms-Young, Associate Director of Research and Education with the UIC Office of Community Engagement and Neighborhood Health Partnership, and Anton Seals Jr., the co-founder and lead steward at Grow Greater Inglewood. Thanks to you both for joining us. Angela Odoms-Young, let's start with you first, please. How would you describe the current state of food insecurity in Chicago?
I think the numbers really speak to the challenges that people are facing in the city. And that really is defined from an economic standpoint. So if we look at the traditional definition of food insecurity, it really is the fear that you will run out of food and not have money to purchase more. That doesn't capture the geographic inequities that exist as well in the dearth of businesses in certain communities that are run and owned by those communities. So partly when we think about food insecurity, we think of it from an economic perspective. That's the USDA definition. But if we add to that the lack of geographic access, the lack of economic development, it even shows how this is compounded when we look at what's happening right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure the pandemic has exacerbated this issue, something that we've been talking about for the last year and a half. Anton Seals Jr., over to you, though. What do you hope comes of this new food policy equity lead position?
Well, I think one of the big things that we want to do is to be able to strengthen the networks and the different silos that existed in the city, to break down some of those silos so that they can further really impact people who are food insecure. I like the way that Dr. Odoms did lay out in terms of, what people are really dealing with. So the issue of access or being able to afford and sustain is still a tremendous issue. So I think one of the big things that will come from this is the potential growth of, an urban ag and food system that is led by many of the people who have been suffering from the kind of divestment that's happened in many of these communities.
Now, as we mentioned earlier, of course, we know Latino, Black and Brown communities are facing this a lot more. Latino communities in particular seeing 29% food insecurity, Black communities 37%, and that's just last year. Angela, what is the health impact on communities who face this, continuing lack of access to food?
It's significant. Many times we think about it from the perspective of only kind of healthy food or what we think of as nutrition security. So people can lack access to healthy food options, and nutrition is the backbone of health. Many of the current chronic conditions that are disproportionately affecting Americans are diet related. So diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, all of these have a root in nutrition, in healthy food consumption. So if you lack access, that's going to have an impact on your health. But I think the other things that people don't think about is the food anxiety and the mental health impact that goes along with lacking access to food in general. So food insecurity can cause food anxiety. If you think about a family that might be in a situation where they fear that they're going to run out of food and not have money to purchase more, that can be very challenging.
And I'm sure that kind of anxiety can, like you said, lead to other greater mental health impacts, possibly even depression. But Anton, I want to get you in here a little bit more. One solution that your group works on, of course, is urban farming. How has that been beneficial to the communities that you work in?
Well, one, it just helps. There's a few things. The historical context, in particular for Black people in the city, the history, the cultural context of, our history and legacy from the shores of Western Africa to down south and helping build this great country and with enormous wealth comes from this kind of agricultural background. So Grow Greater Inglewood was birthed out of the desire and the need to make sure that those in the community also looked like those in the community, and that we were making sure that we were reflecting and pulling up those kind of historical legacies and assets that already exist in the community, people know how to grow food. So they needed a level of support. And so what we've seen is, and one of the things that will come from this Food Equity Council potentially is making sure that we have real clear policies for people to access land, how to remediate land so that we can actually grow food on there. There's a tremendous amount of folks who have, in particular since the pandemic, one of the big takeaways that we need to continue to build on in public health is around the desire for many people to be much more cognizant of their health and taking their health into their own hands. And that's something I think that we need to continue to build on. And it's a super positive thing, even though people aren't dealing with the COVID vaccine in the same way, the COVID-19 vaccine. But those are some real deep ways that we think that we can push this thing forward.
Okay, and I think, well, that's actually a really good place to leave it. We'll have to leave it there. My thanks to Angela Odoms-Young and Anton Seals Jr. for joining us to discuss food insecurity and potential solutions going forward.
Thank you.
Eat your greens.
Yes, sir. Up next, a history lesson in a cemetery. But first, a look at the weather. A Chicago Architecture Center walking tour takes us to the headstones and mausoleums of some of Chicago's most influential activists, politicians, and entrepreneurs who shaped history in the 155 years since the country's first Juneteenth. We brought you this story earlier this summer, and here's another look. For many Chicagoans, the Bishop Ford is just a bustling freeway through the South Side. But the man it's named for, Bishop Lewis Henry Ford,
he was the eulogist at the funeral of Emmett Till.
A funeral that would galvanize the civil rights movement on that fateful day in 1955, after Till was lynched in Mississippi.
The pictures of his corpse were then published in John Johnson's Ebony and Jet for the whole world to see, and every African American in the country was able to see what had happened.
Today, both Johnson and Ford lie in rest just next to each other inside Oakwood Cemetery in the Greater Grand Crossing community. Their final resting place is shared with so many other Chicagoans who helped write the city's and the country's history. The Chicago Architecture Center's walking tour of Oakwood Cemetery, called Civil War to Civil Rights, traces history through the people buried here. Among them, more than 4,000 Confederate military prisoners in a mass grave.
We begin at the Confederate mound, but that's not where we end. That's the end of the Civil War. And then we move into Reconstruction, the Great Migration, and the modern civil rights movement. And all the people here that were involved in all of that difficult transition for our country.
Another theme that is a part of the tour when we talk about Reconstruction is that people often have the feeling that history is always about progress. You're always moving forward, things are always getting better. But what we see in some examples on this tour is that there's often a lot of regression.
Erica Miles is one of the docents for this tour, along with Mary Jo Hogue, who wrote it. During the tours, they explain to visitors the significance of Chicago's first black mayor, Harold Washington.
He was elected mayor in 1983, and unfortunately he passed in 1987. But if you look at what he was able to do in that span of time, it's pretty amazing.
And anti-lynching crusader and journalist Ida B. Wells.
It was, just amazing to me to learn about what she did, the time that she did it, how very dangerous it was, and how significant it was in terms of raising the awareness of what was happening to African Americans.
Also buried here, Olympic great Jesse Owens, who beat Hitler's Nazis in track and field at the 1936 Olympics. Miles explains history, dates, and places are important, but what she really hopes visitors can sense is the context of the time period.
We tend to mythologize these people, and we tend to make them larger than life, and we say, well, they were able to accomplish this because they were this, super human person, but that's often not the case. It's often just regular people who are rising to the challenge.
Other notables buried at Oak Woods include social services advocate Ada S. McKinley and Negro League baseball icon Ted Double Duty Radcliffe. The Chicago Architecture Center is offering the Civil War to Civil Rights tour on an additional 2 dates this year, the next of which is this Saturday, September 4th. You can visit our website to learn more. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Monday night.
Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Congressional members on the Intelligence Committee talk about the suicide bombings and the U.S. pullout of Afghanistan.
And how the Gage Park Latinx Council is teaching youth how to be historians of their own community.
And join WTTW News reporter Joanna Hernandez for tonight's Chicago Tonight Latino Voices Community Conversation. She's talking with entrepreneurs who've started or expanded their businesses during the pandemic. You can RSVP at WTTW.com/events, and the conversation gets going at 8 o'clock right after the show tonight. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm named on the 2021 expertise list of the best personal injury attorneys in Chicago.